Okay, this next little video, I can put it as part of these dot points, but essentially it's just a term that I really want us to understand. It's this term of reproductive isolation. What does it mean to be reproductively isolated from someone? So this could be a driving factor in terms of the founder effect and the bottleneck effect. Essentially, so all of these methods of gene flow, they have to result in reproductive isolation, and this is what actually drives speciation and organisms becoming completely different species to one another. So in our global human population, humans can mate with each other from all over the world and produce fertile offspring. And this is what we mean when we say we are the same species. Now, this indicates that we get gene flow occurring. Because we're all able to do this, then it means that genes are flowing between our different populations. And as a result, we can maintain that we are the same species. What would have to happen in order to prevent gene flow between populations? Now, you might be thinking to yourself right now, what have we done that might be stopping gene flow between different populations of humans? So if you're thinking things like closing international borders, then yes, that is something that we are going to stop the gene flow. However, I wouldn't be worried that we're going to speciate and we're going to end up with different types of humans all over the world. We have very long generation times, which means that it takes many years for us to produce offspring and for them to produce offspring. So we're talking, 25, 30, 35, 40 years for one generation. So you'd have to be reproductively isolated for a number of generations in order to possibly speciate into different groups. Now, this has happened in the past, which we come up to at the end of this topic, but for now, we're not going to worry about humans isolating. But what would have to happen is that we would have to not be able to be near each other. So there are a couple of different ways that you can be said to be isolated from someone, or different populations can be isolated. And we're not going to fixate ourselves on humans here. We're going to start thinking outside the box, and we're going to start thinking about other animals. It can even mean plants. Now, again, these two different types of terms are not on the study design, but they help us to think about different ways that the terms are not on the study design, but the examples are on the study design. So I'm just going to break them into two branches because it might help you to think about what we can do to stop this, to make ourselves reproductively isolated, or make a species reproductively isolated from other members of that species. So the first kind of ones that I'm going to go through are the ones that are pre-zygotic. So this means pre-mating. So things that stop things from mating in the first place. And the second one that I'm going to talk about briefly are the ones that happen after you've mated, but prevent you from either making offspring or those offspring having babies. And so here's a really cool little table. You might want to pause, just have a look at some of these. You can write on there, you've got a little table on page number 9. Just some ideas, whichever ones kind of tick your boxes in terms of, oh yeah, I understand that. So having a look at these pre-zygotic mechanisms, you can have what we call temporal isolation. So for example, maybe they're just not on heat at the right times during the year. So there might be one group of individuals that can mate during summer and one that mate during winter, and therefore they're never going to mate, and so therefore they become reproductively isolated. You could have ecological isolation or physical isolation, where you just can't get to each other because you might be in similar areas, but you occupy different habitats. One might live in the trees, one might live on the ground. So the next one is behavioral isolation. This one you see a lot in birds, and they've got an example here to do with crickets. So birds and crickets have very specific courtship rituals. They're pretty cool, but if you don't get the song right or the dance right, then all of a sudden someone's going to be like, no, I ain't mating with you. That's not happening. I'm not having your babies. You didn't dance right. Right? So behavioral isolation is another way to become reproductively isolated. The last one is that maybe mechanically you just don't fit. So they say that there are these different organisms called bush babies And bush babies have very distinctly shaped genitalia that will only allow them to fit with members of their same species. It means that essentially the penis just doesn't fit. And if the penis doesn't fit, then how can you possibly mate and produce fertile offspring? Now, the next one are some of the post-zygotic. So you manage to breed, but what is going to stop your offspring from breeding again? What is going to make them infertile? So the first thing is maybe there are two different frogs that mate, but the tadpoles don't succeed. They die before they even reach adulthood. So therefore they had a baby, but it wasn't fertile. It wasn't viable, let alone fertile. The next one is that the hybrid, so the combination of those two species, is actually infertile. And this would be the example of a donkey, mating with a horse, and they make a mule. So they make offspring, right? You can mate a donkey and a horse, but the offspring is called a mule, and that mule can't reproduce itself. So therefore, we call that they're not the same species. The last one is the hybrid breakdown. So this is when you breed two organisms together, they make an offspring, but that offspring kind of dies quite young, and it's unlikely to be able to breed before it dies. And so all of these things are just different ways that we can be reproductively, or two species can be reproductively isolated. So there are many different ways that we can become reproductively isolated. Mostly we probably talk about these top ones, but just recall that these are different ways that we can separate ourselves from each other to prevent ourselves from breeding.